The architects never stopped building. They just stopped signing their names. Walk through any major city constructed between 1700 and 1920, and you will notice something unsettling. The grand railway stations of London, New York, and St. Petersburg share not merely aesthetic similarity, but identical proportional systems. The government buildings erected across 5 continents during this period repeat the same column spacing, the same arch ratios, the same vault geometries with mathematical precision. We are told this represents the natural spread of neoclassical style, the influence of Beaux-Arts education, the predictable evolution of architectural fashion. But fashion does not produce identical load-bearing calculations across unconnected construction sites. Fashion does not explain why buildings separated by oceans share window dimensions accurate to the centimeter. Style is a surface phenomenon. Structure is something else entirely. Consider the explosion of institutional construction that occurred between 1800 and 1914. Across Europe, the Americas, and European colonial territories, an unprecedented building campaign transformed urban landscapes. Museums, libraries, government headquarters, railway terminals, hospitals, universities, all rising simultaneously in cities that had no direct administrative connection. The official narrative presents this as independent local development, each city choosing its own architects, funding its own projects, expressing its own civic aspirations through stone and steel. Yet the buildings themselves tell a different story. They speak in a common language that transcends national boundaries and cultural contexts. The reading rooms in major libraries from Moscow to Washington share not just decorative elements, but structural systems. The same engineering solutions appear in train stations from Milan to Bombay. The same vault types, the same foundation depths, the same material specifications repeat across thousands of kilometers with suspicious consistency. The conventional explanation invokes the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris as the central node of architectural education during this period. Graduates of this institution, we are told, carried standardized design principles back to their home countries, creating a global architectural network bound by shared training. This theory has appeal. It provides a mechanism for transmission. It accounts for stylistic unity, but it collapses under scrutiny. The École des Beaux-Arts taught design philosophy and aesthetic principles. It did not teach the specific engineering calculations required to construct identical foundation systems in different soil conditions. It did not distribute technical specifications for stress distribution in stone arches or load-bearing capacity of iron columns. These are not matters of style, but of structural mathematics. And the precision with which they repeat across global construction projects suggests not education, but coordination. Not inspiration, but instruction. Examine the documentation surrounding major construction projects of this era, and a pattern emerges. Project timelines show remarkable synchronization. Multiple institutional buildings in different countries frequently break ground within months of each other, despite no apparent connection between funding bodies or planning committees. Material orders for marble, granite, iron, and steel show coordination across international suppliers that should not exist, given the supposed independence of these projects. Construction techniques considered cutting-edge appear simultaneously in multiple locations with no clear point of origin. The diffusion pattern does not match what we would expect from organic technological spread. Instead, it suggests centralized distribution from a source that remains unidentified in official records. The architectural plans themselves present another anomaly. Major institutional buildings from this period often survive in archives with incomplete provenance. The original architect is listed, the construction firm is documented, but the structural engineering specifications frequently appear without clear authorship. These technical drawings, the ones containing the precise calculations for arch thrust, column load, foundation depth, and material stress are the most standardized elements across different projects. They show professional drafting quality that exceeds the capabilities of many listed architecture firms. They contain engineering solutions that would not be independently derived by separate teams working in isolation. And they appear in project files without explanation of their origin, as though structural engineering was not a creative act, but a process of copying from a master template. Who created the master template? This question leads to dead ends in official architectural history. We find famous names: Garnier, Hunt, Berlage, Hastings, associated with decorative programs and spatial planning. But the deep structural systems, the ones that determine how buildings actually stand, trace back to technical offices whose names rarely appear in historical accounts. Engineering consulting firms that worked across multiple continents, technical advisory committees that reviewed plans for diverse clients, standards organizations that publish specifications adopted wholesale by construction industries worldwide. These entities operated in the background of architectural history, their influence visible only in the uniformity of structural systems they left behind. The late 19th century is presented in mainstream history as a period of rapid technological advancement and increasing international cooperation. The narrative emphasizes progress, modernization, the triumph of engineering over traditional building methods. New materials, steel, reinforced concrete, plate glass, enabled structures impossible in previous eras. New techniques, prefabrication, standardization, mechanized construction, accelerated building timelines. New institutions, engineering schools, professional associations, international conferences, facilitated knowledge exchange across borders. This is the story we inherit, and it is not entirely false. Technology did advance. Materials did improve. Knowledge did spread. But beneath this narrative of progress lies a deeper pattern that suggests something more directed than natural evolution. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. Look at what was actually being built during this period. Not merely buildings, but a global infrastructure of control, railway networks that reorganized entire nations around centralized hubs, telegraph systems that enabled real-time communication across continents, electrical grids that standardized power distribution in every major city. These were not independent local developments, but coordinated systems requiring unified technical standards. And the buildings housing these systems, the stations, the post offices, the power plants, followed the same architectural template worldwide. They were nodes in a network, and their design reflected their function within a larger system invisible to those who use them. The repeated arch and column motif that defines institutional architecture of this era is more than aesthetic choice. It represents a specific structural system optimized for particular engineering requirements. The arch distributes weight through compression, eliminating the need for complex tensile calculations. The column provides vertical support that can be standardized regardless of local building traditions. Together, they form a modular system adaptable to different scales and functions while maintaining identical core geometry. This is not the signature of artistic style, but of systematic engineering. Design intended for replication rather than innovation, for distribution rather than origin. Consider the speed of construction. Major institutional buildings that today would require 5 to 10 years of planning and construction were completed in 18 to 30 months during this period. The official explanation cites abundant labor, lower regulatory burden, and simpler construction methods. But contemporary accounts describe projects of stunning complexity. Elaborate stone carving, intricate metalwork, extensive foundation engineering, completed on schedules that strain credibility. Either the construction workforce of this era possessed capabilities far exceeding modern standards, or the buildings themselves were not being designed from scratch, but assembled from predetermined components according to existing specifications. Prefabrication explains some of this, but not the consistency of custom elements. Something else was enabling rapid execution across multiple simultaneous projects. The financing of these construction campaigns presents its own mysteries. Institutional buildings require substantial capital investment, and the late 19th century saw an explosion of such investment across multiple continents simultaneously. Where did the money come from? Public budgets show allocations for specific projects, but the scale of construction far exceeds what municipal or national governments could reasonably fund through taxation or borrowing. Private philanthropy played a role. Carnegie libraries, Vanderbilt universities, Rockefeller hospitals. But even accumulated industrial fortunes cannot account for the total capital deployed. The sums involved suggest coordination at a level beyond individual donors or government agencies. They point to financial systems capable of directing resources across national boundaries toward unified objectives. Banking networks, investment consortia, international loan structures binding multiple nations into shared infrastructure development. The workforce itself deserves examination. Who actually built these structures? Official records list construction companies, but the skilled labor, the stonemasons, the ironworkers, the engineers, frequently traveled between projects in different countries. A mason working on a library in Philadelphia might appear months later on a museum project in Buenos Aires. An engineering supervisor consulting on a station in Vienna would next be found overseeing construction in Melbourne. This was not typical labor migration, but organized deployment of specialized workers following construction projects around the globe. They carried not just tools, but knowledge. Specific techniques, exact specifications, practiced methods that ensured consistency across diverse sites. They were part of a mobile technical workforce that transcended national employment systems, and their movement patterns suggest central coordination rather than individual job seeking. The materials themselves traveled similar paths. Granite quarries in specific regions supplied stone for buildings on multiple continents. Iron foundries produced standardized structural components shipped to diverse construction sites. Glass manufacturers delivered identical window specifications to projects with no apparent connection. The supply chain supporting this global construction campaign required logistics networks of extraordinary sophistication. Shipping routes, storage facilities, quality control systems, payment mechanisms spanning multiple currencies and jurisdictions. These networks existed, and they operated with efficiency that rivals modern global supply chains despite supposedly inferior 19th century communication and transportation technology. The coordination required suggests institutional structures larger than individual companies or national governments. What were these buildings actually for? The official functions, governance, education, transportation, cultural preservation, do not fully explain their design. The grand reading rooms with vaulted ceilings far higher than necessary for book storage. The entrance halls with acoustic properties unsuited to casual conversation. The hidden service corridors and basement networks that extended far beyond operational requirements. Many institutional buildings from this era contain spaces whose purpose remains unclear. Rooms without obvious function. Structural elements that serve no apparent load-bearing role. Architectural features that make sense only if the building was designed for purposes beyond its stated use. Were these structures intended from the beginning to serve multiple functions, Were they built to specifications that anticipated uses not revealed to the public, or even to the nominal clients funding construction? The symbolism embedded in architectural ornament deserves attention. The repeated motifs, eagles, classical figures, geometric patterns, astronomical symbols, appear with consistent placement across buildings worldwide. These are not random decorative choices, but carefully positioned elements following specific iconographic programs. The same symbols appear in the same locations relative to structural features. Entrance pediments display identical allegorical scenes. Interior rotundas contain matching celestial mappings. Column capitals repeat identical foliate patterns. This level of symbolic coordination suggests not artistic influence, but adherence to a predetermined iconographic system. A visual language embedded in stone that communicates meaning across cultures and nations to those trained to read it. The acoustics of large institutional spaces present another technical mystery. Many reading rooms, assembly halls, and public lobbies from this era demonstrate sound properties that require sophisticated understanding of wave propagation and resonance. These buildings were constructed before modern acoustic engineering existed as a formal discipline, yet they exhibit acoustic optimization that rivals purpose-built concert halls. How did architects and builders achieve this? Trial and error cannot explain the consistency of results across multiple projects. Direct acoustic testing during construction would require instruments and methodologies not documented in historical records. The most plausible explanation is that the acoustic properties were built into the structural specifications themselves. Ratios and proportions that produce desired sound characteristics as emergent properties of the spatial geometry. This represents engineering knowledge far beyond what official architectural history attributes to this period. The foundation systems of these buildings tell their own story. Excavations beneath institutional structures from this era frequently reveal foundation work far more extensive than necessary for the buildings they support. Over-engineered basements, redundant structural supports, foundation depths extending into geological strata requiring no such reinforcement given the surface load. Why build so deep? Why include structural capacity far exceeding requirements? Modern engineers examining these foundations note their resemblance to seismic engineering or to structures designed to support far greater weight than the existing buildings present. Were the foundations built to support planned expansions that never occurred? Or were they following standard specifications without regard to actual site requirements, copying a template designed for different conditions and applying it universally? The documentation gaps become most apparent when examining construction oversight. Major projects typically generate extensive administrative records. Inspection reports, change orders, progress photographs, contractor correspondence. For many institutional buildings from this era, these routine documents are missing or fragmentary. The buildings exist. Their completion is documented. But the process of construction disappears into archival silence. This pattern appears too frequently to attribute to normal document loss. It suggests either systematic removal of records after completion or construction methods that generated less documentation than comparable modern projects. Either explanation is troubling. What were builders and clients trying to obscure? Or what was so routine about the construction process that it required minimal documentation despite the scale and complexity of the projects? The transition away from this architectural system around 1920 is as abrupt as its emergence a century earlier. The standardized institutional style that dominated global construction for over 100 years suddenly fragments into diverse regional movements. Art Deco, Modernism, Bauhaus, International style. Multiple new architectural languages appear simultaneously, each rejecting the classical arch and column system that preceded them. The official narrative presents this as natural artistic evolution. a rebellion against outdated tradition, the embrace of new materials and social philosophies. But the timing suggests something else. The global construction campaign that built thousands of identical institutional structures across 5 continents simply stopped. The technical specifications that guided projects from Melbourne to Montreal were suddenly abandoned. The financial networks that funded simultaneous construction in dozens of cities redirected their capital elsewhere. The mobile workforce that traveled between projects dispersed. Whatever system had produced a century of architectural uniformity dissolved almost overnight. What ended it? World War I is the conventional explanation. A disruption so profound, it shattered the international order, enabling global architectural coordination. The war certainly affected construction. Labor and materials were diverted to military purposes. International cooperation became impossible. Established institutions collapsed. But the architectural shift preceded the war's conclusion. By 1918, while the conflict still raged, new building styles were already emerging that rejected everything the previous century had established. The transition was not a response to wartime disruption, but a deliberate break occurring alongside it. As though the war itself was part of a larger reorganization that included the architectural realm. The system that built identical structures across continents did not collapse. It was replaced, its technical networks and financial mechanisms redirected toward different objectives. The buildings remain. Walk through any major city and you pass them daily. The post offices, the libraries, the museums, the stations. They stand solid and familiar. Their arch and column facades so common, we no longer see them as remarkable. But they are remarkable. They represent the physical evidence of a global system that operated for over a century, with precision and scale that defies the historical narrative of independent national development and organic architectural evolution. They are not examples of style spreading through influence, but nodes in a constructed network. Monuments to a coordination that has been erased from official history. Whoever designed this system, whoever directed its implementation across continents, whoever controlled the financial and technical resources necessary to build thousands of identical structures in dozens of countries. They possessed capabilities that exceed what we attribute to 19th century institutions. They operated at a scale that suggests not a collection of nations pursuing separate agendas, but a unified structure directing development from a position above national governments. The question is not whether this system existed. The buildings prove it did. The question is what else it built that we no longer recognize as constructed rather than natural. If global architecture was directed from a hidden center for over a century, what other aspects of the modern world emerged from the same source? If the spaces we inhabit daily were designed according to specifications we did not choose, what other systems were implemented without our awareness? The arches and columns repeat, not because architects shared taste, but because they followed instructions. The instructions came from somewhere. That somewhere left no archives, no museums, no monuments to its own existence. It inscribed itself instead in the fabric of cities worldwide, hiding in plain sight behind the facade of official history. The architects never stopped building. They just stopped signing their names. And what they built surrounds you now, familiar and invisible, its true purpose encoded in proportions and patterns that speak only to those who remember how to read them.